that. Always forget about that. Okay. So, hi everybody. In typical me style, I've got some slides we're gonna jump through here. So I'm gonna put that link in the chat, and I'm also gonna put it in Slack, just so everyone's got access to it. Um, so I don't know if Max has talked about or mentioned what we're going to be talking about today, but today and tomorrow, I'm going to be bringing you all through integrating uh, authentication into your blog app. So we're going to talk a little bit about authentication and authorization, actually some stuff we talked about way back when I was teaching the networking stuff. So we're going to kind of cover that again as a little bit of a review. And then we're going to use a service called Clerk and integrate that into our application so we can use it for signing in. We'll talk a little bit about like what Clerk does for us and why it's kind of a decent way to solve this problem. Okay, that was kind of what's the plan. So let's start off by talking a little bit about authentication versus authorization. So if you think back, way back to the networking stuff, these should be some terms that you've heard before. Authentication is verifying that a user is who they say they are. So as a great example, like let's say you sign into a web application. The act of signing in, that's authenticating. So authenticating is saying like you are user XYZ. When you authenticate, like you can get information about a user because you know sort of who they are, so you can sort of use that to tie to information you have in your system. So if they sign in and you know they're user XYZ might have a bunch of information associated with it, maybe like a users table or something like that. However, it doesn't tell you what user XYZ can or cannot do. That's authorization. So authorization is, okay, you know who this person is. Now we can figure out, okay, so if this person is user XYZ has permission to create posts, but they don't have permission to delete posts, for example. So this is like a subtle nuance, but it's really important. And there's sort of there are two different problems that both often kind of get wrapped up into one. That's why I kind of labeled this auth. Often people will just say auth as a substitute for meaning both authentication and authorization, or one or the other. It's sort of an ambiguous term, kind of on purpose. So we are today going to be talking about authentication pretty much completely. And tomorrow we're going to maybe briefly at the end of the day or end of the class touch on authorization. But pretty much for the most part, we're going to be talking about authentication. So a user logging in and sort of like knowing, okay, this user's logged in and getting information about them, but not actually integrating like information about that user into the application around like what they can and can't do. That being said, if after this you want to give that a shot on your own, it might be a good exercise. Okay. So I guess I should say before I keep going, any questions about authentication or authorization? Should hopefully be a review. Okay, great. So there's a lot of ways that you can build authentication into a web application. In fact, you've talked a little bit about this with Max already. In the blog application, you've built a little example of like a login workflow. So you can have like a login endpoint, you have like a users table and a bunch of that stuff. And this is kind of one of the most basic sign-in workflows you can make. It's kind of a thing that probably if you've used the web for any amount of time, you've run into countless versions of this, the username and password sign-in workflow. And I think you've already talked about it with Max, but I'm just going to go through it again just to make sure we're all on the same page about how this works. So generally, you have a pair of boxes, a username or an email address or some sort of like public user identifier. And then you have like a password, which is a private identifier that only you know. The idea is that, I mean, hopefully everyone knows this, but like you yourself should be the only one who knows the password. So no one else can sign in with your credentials, so they don't have them. So the idea is usually the way this works is when you type those credentials into that form and you click submit, the web app will make a request to some sort of endpoint. In this case, post login. The slides I posted in Slack and also in the chat for whoever asked. Sorry, I didn't see. So either place you can get them from. So the form will make a request, some sort of endpoint, in this case, like /login, and include in that request some data about the username and password. Sends that request to the server. Then when the server gets that request, it looks at some sort of users table, usually, something like that, a list of a bunch of users. And what we'll do is it'll try to find a user that matches the credentials that were passed in the request. So for example, this one here, this matches right here, these credentials. Once you sort of have those credentials, there's a few different ways you can kind of give something back to the client so that it can use to make requests from that point forward. What I'm going to walk you through here is kind of probably the most typical these days, but not always how it works. So often there'll be like a tokens table, and you'll make a new record in that tokens table with a token that's sort of linked to the user that signed in. And then you'll send that token, so that newly created token, that green row, you'll send that back to the client. So what happens is, from the client's perspective, you make a request to this login endpoint with a username and password. And if it works, you get back a 200 with the token in the body. If it doesn't work, you get back a 400 of some sort, usually. So then once the client gets that back, the client can then use that token to make requests to the server. And now that token can sort of like stand in place for those users' credentials. And that would typically work with that scheme we talked about way back in networking, where you have like authorization, bearer, your token as a header. So that's kind of very high level how, like, if you wanted to build an authentication system, how you might go about doing it yourself. Any questions about that? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about kind of what's the pros and cons of this approach. So we just walked through kind of what you'd have to do. It's a relatively straightforward thing to implement. There's some moving parts, to be clear. Like, it's not the kind of thing where like it's dead simple, but it's like relatively simple in comparison to a lot of the other ways you could go about solving this problem. Also, everyone who uses the internet is familiar with the whole idea of like signing in. If you have a way that someone can make a username and password, like that's something users are going to be very familiar with, and you're not going to have to write like a lot of custom logic to walk you through your like crazy sign-in workflow. And this is sort of the thing, important point here. If you implement it correctly, it's relatively secure. But that's quite a big if. Implementing this kind of thing correctly is very challenging. And in what we just walked through, there are actually a couple security holes that I kind of left in just because I wanted to point them out here to kind of get you into the mindset of like, oh, might be some places you can like attack this thing. Generally, when making things where security is of paramount importance, it's often best, if possible, to rely on other people's implementations of things. So kind of the thought being like, there are other people who are smarter than I am, who have spent like years and years of focused effort thinking about this problem. Let's use their solutions rather than trying to solve the problem ourselves. It's not to say that people don't solve it themselves. If you have a situation where like your stakes are pretty low, okay, that's probably fine. If you have a situation where you want to build it for fun to learn, oh yeah, that's a lot of fun and totally fine. I mean, I've done that a ton of times. But if you're building an application where you really want to be 100% sure that like you don't have any like obvious security holes, you might consider like not writing this kind of thing yourself. So I just kind of touched on this, but it's very easy to get something very subtly wrong with this kind of thing and accidentally leave open a quite large vulnerability that leaves the system insecure. We're going to talk a little bit about some of those in a second. But the other thing, too, that I think people often underestimate when they build their own versions of these workflows is you don't just need a login workflow. You also have all the other stuff that you have to have whenever you have an account management system. So you have to have some sort of way that a user can do like a forgot password thing. So they can have an email sent to their email or something with like a forgot password link that goes back into your application. It's like that's the whole thing you got to figure out. There's the whole user profile page where like people can edit like their name and like user settings and all that. And in there you probably also have another reset password workflow, or a separate password workflow for like when you're signed in, changing your password. And there's like all the security stuff around like, oh, maybe you have like a bunch of people logged in and you want to be able to like revoke access to everyone who like currently is logged in. There's a lot of stuff around like compliance. So if any of you are familiar with like GDPR, which is a privacy regulation that was introduced in Europe in the late 2010s, that has a bunch of implications on how you build account systems. Because there's things like in GDPR, what's called the right to be forgotten, where like users who are in the EU by law have the right to make a request to any web service, any website they access, and request all their data be deleted on them. Now you don't have to necessarily abide by that if you're a US only thing, or if you're small enough where you may be able to fly under the radar. But there are also the CCPA is like a regulation. There's some regulations that are somewhat similar in California. So like this is all to say that like this is quite a rabbit hole. And if you're trying to do this and do a really good job, there's a lot of surface area you have to cover. And I just sort of scratched the surface there. Just like thinking back to past problems I've had and custom rolled account systems I've been part of building. So any questions on any of that? Okay, cool. Let's talk a little bit about an example vulnerability in the system that I just walked you through. So I think Max has covered this already. So you might have noticed this when we were going through this, but I stored my passwords in plain text in the database, which is often something that people who don't know what they're doing tend to do. This is very bad. A reason why this is very bad is if anyone gets access to your database, now that could be through something nefarious. That could be like someone like enacts legal action on you and needs like a dump of your database, part of like legal discovery. Like there's a lot of different reasons this can happen, but like if your data gets out, all your users' passwords are now in the clear, available for anyone to read and use. And given that most users are not so great with password hygiene and tend to reuse passwords across websites, now all of a sudden you have a big data breach where like people, like hackers, can use these credentials and try to stuff them into other forms and try to log in as users. It just becomes a real big mess. So Max, I think, has drilled this into your head. I'm going to say it again. But if you ever are building your own account system, at a minimum, you need to hash and salt your passwords. I think Max has talked about what that means. I'll just quickly mention it now, just because like it's probably worth knowing a little bit about what that means. So there are what are called hash functions. They are these class of mathematical functions where if you feed in text, any sort of input, and then you run it through the function, out the other end, you get gibberish. But importantly, whenever you feed the same input into that hash function, you always get the same gibberish. So what's really nice about that is if you store the gibberish, then if you want to validate a password matches without actually having the password stored, you can run the password through the hash function, generate the gibberish, and make sure they match. And if they don't match, your password doesn't match. You don't actually have to know what the password is. You just know that their hashes are the same. That's like that's like one level up from storing just a plain text password. Like, congratulations, you're storing some hashes. That's good. But and I'm going through this because I want to give you like an idea of some of the complexity around this and why people like all the thought people putting into like trying to attack these systems. There's a kind of attack what's called a rainbow table attack. So imagine like thinking about what I just said, where if you have a password and you run it through a hash function, you always get the same value. Imagine two users have the same password. So what you can do is if you know that two users have the same password, then their hashes are going to be the same. So you can actually, like, by looking through the database table, figure out, like, deduce, oh, these users have the same passwords. And on top of that, for most common hash functions, people have actually done the brute force and pre-computed all the possible hashes for like a bunch of like various inputs. So think about like someone making a big loop and being like, okay, compute the hash of A, compute the hash of B, C, D, on and on, A, B, A, C, A, B, A, C, on and on, computing all the different permutations. And that takes a lot of compute time and processing power. But importantly, you only have to do it once. And once that's computed, you now have a mapping back and forth. And what that means is you can look at a database with purely hashed passwords. Anything that's like a common phrase or a common simple like short password, it's probably in a rainbow table, and you can look it up and like reverse that hash quickly. So this is the thing where like that's the kind of thing where like you might not think of that as like an attack vector, but it's like a very common thing. And even with hashed passwords and database dumps, it's something that happens quite often. So to try to work around that, sort of like the next layer in the arms race, what ended up happening is this idea of salting came around. So the idea of salting is you store along with your password this sort of like other random like string. And effectively what you do is you take your password and you take that random string and you concatenate them together and then you hash that. So why that's helpful is by adding that randomness to your password, you're sort of avoiding it being in a rainbow table. And also because the randomness is different for every user, the same password hashes are not going to align for the same users. So like if one user has the password of test and the other user has the password of test, because their salts are different, test plus the salt and hashed for user A and test plus the different salt hashed for user B are going to be different. So there's a few more layers of this that I could go through. I'm not going to go into it now because I don't think it's that important. I guess I'm hoping that was interesting for some folks, but I think really the takeaway here is that there's a lot of thought that's been gone into this of like both trying to write secure account implementations and sign-in implementations, and also people trying to like attack them and figure out like subtle vulnerabilities that can use to exploit in them to be able to like break into these systems. So if you really are worried about security, like take that into account and consider either spending a lot of time getting very familiar with these kinds of problems or like just using something someone else has written. Any questions about any of that? Okay. So these days, because it's so easy to get stuff wrong, more often than not, engineers tend to use third-party services that implement sign-in workflows for us. It's not like you won't see it everywhere, especially like companies that are sort of older or companies where they have sort of like infrastructure in place. They'll often have some pre-existing account system. And it's the kind of thing where like if it's been battle hardened and tested over the years, it might be fine. Might also not be, but it might be fine. So that might be okay. Um, I think this is more a recommendation for like greenfield things. So if you're starting something from scratch, and like you should think about using something that's already built, if you want to really have like maintain high security. So there are a bunch of these services out there. Probably the most popular one historically, or maybe like the first like major well-known one was called Auth0. Um, so what that effectively is it's like a toolkit that allows you to like integrate it into your system, and they sort of manage all the account stuff for you. Um, they also, like, another reason why they became really big is they also manage what's called SAML and an SSO. So if you end up working with like larger enterprises, there's this technology SAML that effectively allows like an enterprise to have like a server that they manage that stores like all their user information. And then third-party apps can connect to that server that sort of stores all that user information and then allow you to like sign in with their user information. And the reason why they like that is they can have one server to manage all their user credentials across their whole company. And then whenever they like fire someone or hire someone, they just update it in that one place. And that sort of by design, like adds or revokes access to everything at the company. So it's like a nice sort of security approach that they have. But that's something where, like, if you're building an account system and you're working with a company that's catering to enterprises, it's something you probably will have to figure out. So to not have to do that and to be able to rely on another service that does it well, that's really nice. Anyway, there's been a number of these services, and it's kind of like a new one every 6 months that like goes around Hacker News that people are excited about. They generally all kind of do the same thing. We're going to talk about one today called Clerk. And the reason why we're going to talk about Clerk is because all of these services, kind of what they end up trading is code complexity for like configuration complexity. So what you're doing is when you set up one of these services, you're doing a lot of like writing configuration or I guess either writing configuration in code or like clicking around a web dashboard and setting things up. And there's a lot of trial and error in getting it to work. And it's never really like super plug and play and easy. Clerk is the only one of these tools I have used where it has actually been pretty plug and play easy. And I don't know what they've done, but like I've used it in probably like 10 or so projects now, both professionally and personally, and I've been pretty impressed by like how well it works. So we're going to go through it today. That being said, the majority of the concepts in something like Clerk will transfer to Auth0 or similar tools. So it's not like we're going to talk, we're like pigeonholing ourselves into Clerk, but I think Clerk provides a good gentle on-ramp for you all. Okay. So some things that Clerk does that goes above and beyond our sort of example little sign-in workflow that I walked you through. So Clerk very easily supports SSO. So that means have you ever seen like the sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, sign in with GitHub, sign in with insert provider here? That's called SSO, single sign-on. That's a pretty common request that users often have in applications these days. Clerk just kind of supports it out of the box, which is pretty good. Clerk also has support for two-factor authentication out of the box, which is pretty sweet. That's another thing where I didn't talk about that. If you need to set that up, like that is a whole fun project because you have like the SMS based and the like Google Authenticator based. There's sort of like different requirements. So you end up having like two parallel implementations you have to manage. They also have the whole like sign up, sign in, change password workflow, that whole situation, like all the stuff I talked about. They have all that implemented, and they have it's pretty well implemented. Okay, before we get started, we're going to start to write some code now, and that's going to kind of be the rest of the class. Any questions about any of these things I've talked about? Auth, the user user login like scenario I walked through, kind of the pros and cons, and anything about Clerk. Yeah, Terry, go for it.
How would like someone first of all get access to like your database and like take all like the passwords and stuff? You mentioned that it's a security uh vulnerable if we do it set up with like the tables and stuff with the IDs.
Yeah, so
Um,
it's a good question. So the way that security systems used to be designed in information technology is you would sort of like think about like a castle in like the Middle Ages. So the way that kind of the security works there is you have this like very big wall around the outside. And then the idea is like you put all your effort into defending against people not being able to get into the castle. But if someone gets inside of the castle, it's kind of like game over. So what you do is you put all your work at like the perimeter and you're defending your perimeter heavily. And then within your perimeter, you kind of like don't really care because it's sort of like just assume that if anyone gets in here, like it's game over. So that's how things used to be done. That's called perimeter security. And that's not really like seen as the best practice anymore. Um, Typically what you do is you have layers of security. So think about like if you've ever like watched a spy movie, often there's like a plot point where they have like there's like level 1 security in the building, and then like level 2 and level 3. And if you get into level 3, that's like the super secure area. So that's kind of more how web applications that are built at larger scales are architected to be more secure. So you have these sort of different like zones within the application that sort of all have their own security perimeters. So instead of having like one massive like wall around the outside, you have small little walls around everything. So why am I saying all this? Well, because a core principle of why perimeter security doesn't really work is because if you breach that perimeter, then it's kind of game over. So how you might breach that perimeter is kind of out of scope of this conversation, but just for like some things to think about. Like imagine you are able to do something like get some like social engineer somebody into running some code on a system that they run that has credentials to access inside of the castle. That could be maybe one way. Um, or something like maybe you maybe somebody accidentally publishes to a public GitHub repository a token that gives someone access to access the inside of the castle. Like that's maybe another example. So this is all to say that like it's definitely possible for external actors to get into your perimeter. And the idea here was something like why you would want to think about all this at the database level for users is because if someone's able to exfiltrate that database out, now all of a sudden, like that's another layer. So now you've got like your database, you've got some like credentials that protect your database. You probably, if you're working at an organization that has sort of like larger scale infrastructure, you've probably also like network scoped your database so that only the application servers can talk to it. So like that's another level of security. But then like if someone's able to get into that database and actually access it and connect to it, then like one of the like more final levels is like, okay, they might be able to get the user information, but they're not gonna be able to get the user's passwords. So this is all to say that like this is one layer in that multi-layered security approach. And that's kind of how things tend to be designed these days. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other questions on that or anything else? Okay, cool. So for the rest of the class, we're going to be writing some code, which is going to be exciting. Um, we're all going to set up some Clerk accounts to start with. So we're going to be integrating this auth stuff into the, not React portfolio, I meant blog. So that should say, that you've been working on with Max. And what we're going to do today, so we're going to do something a little different tomorrow, but today we're going to add a private page to the blog application. So the idea is that anyone who is logged in can access this private page and can like view it. And in order for them to view it, they've got to log in. So they've got to authenticate. But there's no authorization at play here, purely authentication. So to start with, hopefully everyone has this code already. Oh, not React portfolio. Gosh, I didn't do a good job of updating this from the last cohort. github.com/hackupstate. Sorry about that. Week 18, day 4. Yeah, this. So I'm assuming everyone has a copy of this code cloned down from working with Max in the past. If you don't, you can clone it down fresh, and that works too. But we're going to be working together in this application for the rest of the class. It's really important you have that locally. So I'm assuming you probably all have that. If you want me to wait a second, let me know and I can pause. But next, we need to all create Clerk accounts. So I've got a little video here, which should autoplay if you click on it on a presentation on your end. showing you what you need to do here. But effectively, go to clerk.com and sign up and go through the process, and it'll sort of bring you to like a form where you can create a new application. So I'm going to do that here along with you all. Clerk.com. Oh, I'm already signed in. So I'm going to sign in. I'm going to sign with my Google account, my personal email. Okay. So I think when you do it, you're going to get brought to this. Can just to make sure that I'm not missing something here, can someone give me a thumbs up once they've gotten here, just to make sure that I'm not missing something? Okay, cool. So in your application name, I'm just gonna put like test app. Doesn't really matter what you put there. So with Clerk, you can sort of pick what ways you want to be able to sign into your application. You can go through and here and select whatever you want. For now, I'm just going to keep the defaults. I would say keep Google enabled. We're going to use that in a second, but otherwise you can kind of enable whatever you want. Part of what's cool about Clerk and a lot of these providers is they sort of normalize all these different sign-in mechanisms to the same underlying data. So from your applications level, you don't really have to care how they logged in, which is pretty neat. So once I do this, I'm going to click Create Application. That's going to bring me here. So I'm going to give everyone a second to do this. If you could give me a thumbs up or a reaction once you've gotten to this point, that'd be helpful. Okay, sweet. I think we got the majority of people who seems like have figured this out. So that's good. Okay, so next we've got our application created. We need to install Clerk locally. So the way Clerk works, they have a cloud part of the application. So that's what's running on their infrastructure that they manage. And then you have a client part of the application that you have to include in your project. So I'm going to go to the blog front end directory that in Max's code here. So I'm going to go cd blog front end. And I'm going to npm install save Clerk React. You can do this in the integrated terminal. Yeah. Sorry, I probably should do it in that. I'm not super VS Code fluent. I'm gonna need to open up VS Code in a second anyway. Okay. So once you've gotten that package installed, there's a few more things we're gonna have to do. In order for our application, our front-end application, to be able to connect itself to the Clerk thing we just made in the cloud, we have to give our application a token so that it can communicate with Clerk and say, I am the client version of the application that was created. So the way we're going to do this, they used to have an easier way to do it, but now Create React App has some it's not as widely supported as it used to be. So we're going to have to kind of do this a bit manually. So if you go to the left here and go to API keys under developers in your application here in Clerk, you should see this thing that says publishable key. So if you click a little copy button next to this, this is the value you're going to want. So now I've got this open in VS Code here. In blog front end, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it .env.local. You may or may not already have this file. I'm not sure if Max has made this with you. I've freshly cloned this. If you have this file already, you can just add this as a new line to the bottom. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to type into here React app clerk publishable key, all uppercase with underscores, exactly like this, equals, and then paste what's in my clipboard. React app clerk publishable key, like this. I'll give everybody a second. If you give me a thumbs up once you've gotten this far, I'd appreciate it.
We're just copying the publishable key.
Yep, just copying the publishable key. I do want to point out that there are a couple different places you can copy it from in the application. You want to make sure that what you're copying starts with PK test and like is just like a random letter and number string. It shouldn't have within it like equals or like look like it. There are some different variations of this with different prefixes they auto-populate, but we want React app clerk publishable key equals our key, and that's it.
We'll have to redo this every time we push this up to GitHub, right? Like we'll have to ignore this file and then redo this whole part.
So good question. If you notice, I don't know if Max has talked about git ignore files with you all. Maybe he has, I'm not sure. Inside of this directory, there's this .gitignore file. What this file does is it will actually tell Git that everything in this file, all these patterns should be ignored by source control. So what's nice is in here, there's actually this .env.local file by default. It's just something Create React app puts in there. So that means that if you try to commit this file with GitHub or Git, it actually won't let you. And that's kind of done on purpose so that like you don't accidentally like commit secrets to GitHub. But what that means is if you clone this thing down fresh, yes, you're going to have to manually create this file, put in this environment variable in there. You're going to have to do that manually. That being said, you should only ever have to do this once when you freshly clone the project onto a new computer or like a new copy of it. This is like a workflow is pretty typical with a lot of these kinds of like, I guess I would say like SDK kind of integrations where you have some sort of like secret you need to include in your front end. I say secret, it's not really secret. It's like because it's in your published JavaScript, but like it's an identifier that like identifies your application as the thing that talks to Clerk. So I guess this is all to say the short version of that is this file shouldn't be committed. It won't be committed by Git by default. And if you freshly clone this project, you're gonna have to recreate this file again. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I'm assuming we're going to go over how to deploy with API keys and such at some point.
Yeah. So you're going to talk about that with Nathan in, I think, a few weeks. I'm not exactly sure. But one thing that I can kind of see the gears turning here, and I think something that you're probably wondering is, this is like a value that is going into our front end code that is fundamentally going to get published to the internet. And anyone could like access our application, and this string is going to be somewhere in that application. So like, is this actually secure? Like, and it's not. Let's be clear. Like that intuition, everything I just walked through there, that's correct. Generally, you shouldn't publish API keys in front-end code. I know that everyone did that as part of the New York Times exercise. And that probably is not best practice, but the risk profile there is pretty low. Like someone used that token to make requests to the New York Times on your behalf, whatever. They might make a rate limit go up, but that's about it. Also, the way that Clerk's been designed is this identifier here is very like they realize it's going to be published. So there's a lot of things that you may want to do with Clerk that actually you can't do with this token because it's only for client-side use. They have some other credential, like a secret key here, that you can use on a server to be able to do more privileged things. So let's say, for example, you want to be able to like dynamically update user credentials, like arbitrarily, like any user. That's something where you don't want to allow the front end code to do that. You need to be able to do that from the server. So I think for that they require you to use a secret key. So this is to say that like Max or Nathan's going to talk about this a little bit, but just fundamentally, don't publish things that should be secret in front end code. That's just like a good rule of thumb. I don't know. I kind of assumed a lot there, Joe, but hopefully that answered what you were thinking.
Yeah, I've done
Okay.
before the cohort, I did a project, and this is the part where I got kind of stuck as I didn't know how to deploy secrets properly, or I guess securely.
Yeah. I mean, like, really, this is a big reason why you often have to put things on a server, because you need to have things that are secret that need to run in a like secured environment that you just fundamentally can't do on a client. So what you often end up doing is to sort of solve this problem is you put the code on the server that requires a secret. And then in order to make a request to that endpoint that runs that code, you include a token that you get from the user signing in. So you're sort of like deferring that auth requirement or that authorization requirement to the sign-in sort of step, or actually, I guess it would be authentication. Yeah, authentication requirement to that sign-in step. And then like you sort of like, because if you're able to validate the user is actually signed in the server endpoint, then you use the actual secret to make the real request on the user's behalf on the server. So that's typically how you tend to solve that problem. But I think Max will probably, or not Max, Nathan will probably go into that more in a few weeks. Yeah, hide it in the back end. I can be kind of long-winded sometimes, I know. Sorry. Okay. Anybody want any more time to set up this .env.local file?
Yeah, I need a minute because I can't find that file that you're on right now.
Which file?
The file that you're on, the dot environment local.
Yeah, you're gonna have to make that. It doesn't exist. It's something you're gonna have to create.
Oh,
It's probably gonna be like, yeah, it's something you're gonna have to create.
Put it in the root.
Okay. So next step, I also should mention the link I included earlier in this, a few slides back, this one. This effectively will walk you through all these steps. So if you want to do this on your own without the slide presentation, like I'm just sort of repackaging Clerk's tutorial here. So the next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to add some code into our application to use this environment variable we've set in the .env.local file. So what this is going to use, this is like stuff that's components that have been implemented in that Clerk React package we just installed. And these components are going to use the publishable key and configure the application so that it can work with Clerk. So the first thing we're going to do, and this is something where it's probably be helpful for you to have the slide open because it's probably something you're going to want to copy and paste. We're going to need to set up Clerk in the root app file. So this is in, should have put it on the slide, I didn't, in src app.js. I'm going to take everything that's in green here and copy it into the file. So I'm going to import this clerk provider thing. I'm going to read from this clerk publishable key thing from that .env.local file. So to explain a little bit on what's going on here, Create React app will by default look at these .env files in your local directory and use that to load in sort of like constants, or I hesitate to use the word secret because I just said it's not really a secret, but like those kinds of things, like build time in variables, kind of. So it will load these in when the application runs, and you can get access to them on this process.env value. So what I'm doing here is I'm just checking to see to make sure this exists, and if it doesn't exist, I'm throwing an error. And then if it does exist, I'm just storing it into this variable here, clerk publishable key. I'm going to take this, stick it here. And the last thing I need to do is I need to update clerk, put this clerk provider thing around my whole application. So I'm going to go all the way down to app here. And I'm going to come on. Why is it? I never can get the indentation to work right in VS Code. I need to put some time into figuring that out sometime. Clerk provider. Ooh, didn't we put that? So I've just wrapped the whole existing thing in clerk provider. I'll give everybody a second to finish that up. Do you have any questions? Let me know.
Yeah, where are we putting the if not process? Yeah, that entire line.
Yep. So I would say put it right below all your imports. Doesn't really matter as long as it's just above where this stuff is. Like this variable needs to be defined before it's used here. So I think I put it here. Okay. Anybody need any more time? Okay. So we now at this point have Clerk integrated into our application. The only requirement we need is that Clerk provider. That being said, we've integrated it, but we haven't actually used it for anything yet. And in order to actually be able to like do something useful with Clerk, we need to add some logic to the application that like checks with Clerk to see if a user has logged in or not. So Clerk has a bunch of different ways you can do this. I'm going to walk you through one way, the way that the tutorial explains in kind of a relatively straightforward way, but I've done it a few different ways in different applications. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a few more routes to the application. So in that my routes thing with the browser router that Max has set up with you all, we're going to add 3 more routes. We're going to add a sign in and a sign up route. So what this will do, this will use some built-in components in Clerk to implement sign in and sign up workflows so that users can go through those. And they'll all be hosted within our application. So a user can go to our app/sign in or our app/sign up and go through those workflows. Then we're going to add a new page /protected. what this is going to do is it's going to render some markup inline. We're going to move this out into a component later, but for now, we're just going to render it inline. That within it uses these two components, signed in and signed out. So these are Clerk components. And what this will do is these components, when a user is signed in, anything in the signed in component will render. And if the user is not signed in, then this, like what's in this component won't render. So you can sort of use these as sort of like conditionals to render things whether a user is signed in or signed out, which is kind of nice. It's all of this component that Clerk has called redirect to sign in. So what this will do is if you render this component, then Clerk will automatically redirect you to the sign-in page and force you to manually sign in before you can actually view the page. So this sort of little like section here, what this effectively is doing is if you're signed out, forcing you to sign in, and if you're signed in, showing you a little like text thing that says this page is protected. And then we also need to add a little bit more to this Clerk provider to sort of tell it how to interact with our application and how to programmatically navigate. So I'm going to add all these things into our code. So I'm going to add all these into the import here at the top. And then I'm going to add all these routes just to the bottom of the route list. I don't think the order really matters that much here. Oops. Yeah, my indentation's all kinds of messed up. Okay. Okay. Something kind of like that. Please do a better job indenting than I am right now. And then lastly, this part. Okay. Cool. So I'll give you all a moment to copy all that stuff in. Give me a thumbs up once you're done. If you have any questions, let me know.
Where we need to put the last little bit again?
This part right here, is that what you're referring to? So that goes, you have this Clerk provider component we made in the last step with the publishable key included here. You want to include this as one more prop on this component. Cool. Okay. If everyone's good, I'll keep moving forward. Okay, so there's one other thing that I noticed when I was adapting this to Max's code, and that's that he already has a bit of a login process that he's built for you, or you've built together in the application. So because we're going to be building our kind of own custom or our own Clerk built login process, I want to update a few things, just make it a little bit less confusing. Neither of these is required, but just like I think is probably a good idea. So the first thing is in app.js, there's this login route that Max set up. I'm just going to rename this to be old outdated login, like make it very clear this is like not Clerk stuff. Like this is like the thing that Max did that built with you all. So this is like not actually like the real login workflow. And you may also choose to like just get rid of this outright just because it's kind of like actively confusing. but I'm going to keep it around because I think Max might be doing some stuff with you all with it going forward. So I just don't want to just like delete this code. The other thing I'm going to do is in home.js, there was a link that Max had to log in down here. I'm going to swap this for a link that says login with Clerk, that instead of going to log in, goes to /signin. So effectively what this will do is this will instead use our Clerk login code and not the old login code. So neither of these steps are required, but are going to make it less confusing for you, I think, in the future. So I'd recommend you do them. Okay. If anybody wants more than a bit more time, let me know, but I'm going to keep moving forward otherwise. Cool. Okay. At this point, we've put all the code we need into our project as like a minimum Clerk implementation. So now we have a little bit of configuration we have to do in Clerk's dashboard. So if you go back over to the dashboard here, what we need to do is go down to paths here on the side. I've also got a little video. Oh, wait, no, I don't. I used to. Now I just have a screenshot. What we're going to need to do is we're going to need to update all these paths. So the sign-in path is /sign-in, sign-in. The sign-up path is /sign-up. And then at the very bottom here, the page where users should go after they sign out is just going to be /. So you could change these if you want, but what these are all going to do is these are configuring how Clerk works. So when a user is automatically forced to sign in, it's going to go to /sign-in. When a user is forced to sign up, it's going to go to that /sign-up. And then when a user is logged out, whether because they asked to or because they were automatically logged out, it's going to redirect the user to /. So I'm going to click save to save that. Okay. And that's all we have to do initially to get Clerk to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run npm start. Oh, oops. I'm going to have to stop something I've already got running. Let me do that real quick just to make sure that everything's good. Okay. Sorry about that. So, oops, not that. This. Okay, looks like there's an issue on line 66 that we missed. Ah, yes. Thought I tested this. I guess I missed something. I believe it's use router. Okay, give me one moment. I clearly forgot something here. I just want to look at my code on my other computer and check to see what it is that I forgot to include in the slide. Sorry. Oh, yeah. This was a change I forgot to make in this shouldn't say router.navigate. This should say my routes.navigate. That's the problem. So I'm going to make that quick change here. Sorry about that. My routes.navigate. Okay. And this whole situation, we don't need that. Oh, yeah, and I got to start my backend server getting all the pieces up and running here. Okay, so I've got my back end running in one terminal, got my front end running in another terminal, and I've got my front end in a web browser. So everyone give me a thumbs up once they've gotten the front end started, the back end started, and have the application open in their web browser, just to make sure that everyone's keeping up. Cool. So we're going to try a few different things here to sort of exercise all the different scenarios that one can go through. So you'll notice here we have this login with Clerk link now. That's sort of what we swapped out on that home page. Let's start though by going to /protected. So that was that endpoint or that route we set up in the application that was going to show the we're on a protected route red text. So if I go to this, what we're going to see is it's going to redirect me to /signin. And it gives me this. So this is the Clerk sign-in form. Oh, Terry, go for it.
Yeah, mine's giving me an error. My route is not defined.
So make sure, I made this mistake in the slide, and make sure that for this area here where you have the navigate prop, you have myroutes.navigate. That was a typo I had on the slide that I had to fix after the fact. It should be updated on the slide now, but I just want to call that out. That's probably what the error is. Was that it?
Yeah, I fixed it, but now it's giving me a whole another error.
Do you want to share your screen? Let's take a look at what's going on.
Oops. Can you see my screen?
Ooh, this is fun. Okay. Can you go over to VS Code and take a look at that .env.local file?
Oh, yeah. Oops, no, it doesn't affect.
Can you go to the beginning of your line there?
Mhm.
Oh, there's some square brackets around PK test. Can you remove those? I think that might be the problem. I think there's one at the end too. Yeah, try saving that and refreshing your application, or yeah, restarting it in the terminal. I think you might need to do that as well. Try refreshing your web browser just to make sure that if you open up developer tools, do you see anything in the JavaScript console that's interesting? Yeah, that should be fine. Go back over to your app.js files, take a look at the code you copy in and make sure that looks right. Oh, yeah. So you see where it says on line 76, put all the rest of your app's code in here. You should, if you you need to put the rest of the code in there that that was there previously. So let me get what that was so I can just send it to you. And yeah, okay. Joe's got you there. So it's like a div class name app, and then a router provider thing inside. So if you take a look at the chat, it's what Joe pasted. You need to include that inner div inside of the Clerk provider.
Stop this.
I think if you do that, it should work for you.
We're good.
Cool. Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let me share my screen again here. Okay, so I just went back to the root here. So I'm going to go to /protected again. And it redirects me to sign in. Now I can do a few things here. I'm just going to click continue with Google and then sign in with my Google account. And then I get redirected back to that protected page. And it says this page is protected. So it's like pretty cool. Like it kind of, we built that whole little workflow kind of, and it kind of just worked. And now if I go back to the root and then go back to protected, it just sort of lets me in because I'm logged in. So everyone give that a shot, just so you can verify Clerk's all set up right on your end. You should be able to go to /protected and be forced through the sign-in workflow and see this page is protected. Let me know if you have any questions with that, doing that.
Did you make a new page called protected?
Yep. Right here. That was part of what was copied in right here, or should have been copied in right here.
The expected output is I should see this page is protected because all I'm seeing is the sign into test screen.
So what you should see is when you go to the page the first time, you should see the sign-in screen, and you should be forced to sign in. So go through that sign-in workflow. And after you sign in, you should see this page is protected. And then if you go to the page from that point, at any point forward, you should see this page is protected. So you should be forced through that sign-in workflow the first time, and then from that point onwards, okay, cool. Sweet. Anybody having difficulty seeing this page is protected? Okay. So what you should see is something kind of like this. So I do want to quickly say that both today and tomorrow are material. Both days, they're kind of shorter days. I don't really have like if we try to pack it into one day, it's like it's too much. But like it's kind of also not really enough for like 2 days. So we're kind of almost done here. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think we have a few options. We can take our break now and maybe come back at like around 7-ish and then finish it up. And then we'll probably be done a little bit early. Or we can kind of go through all this now, get all of day one done, and start on the tomorrow's material, and then take our break in between. So we'll probably take a break if we went that path, like maybe like 7:15 or so, if I had to guess. So what do you all want to do? Do you want to try to do you want to leave it as like 2 relatively easy days, or do you want to like try to get through as much as we can today and then have a kind of whatever's left tomorrow? What would kind of be what you all would prefer?
Asmo's asking if you could do a poll.
Oh, oh yeah. That's a great idea. Let me figure out how to do that. I'm not as Zoom literate as Max is.
Should be under the More button, I believe, or maybe under apps.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Polls, quizzes. Okay. 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 Save as meeting poll. Launch. Did that do something for all of you? Okay. Yeah, everyone wants an easy day. I don't blame you. Okay. Cool. Well, I think that settles it. So let's take our break now. Let's get back at like 7:15 or something. I think that's like yeah, about like half an hour. And then we'll move on to the rest of it and maybe have some time for some extra fun stuff. And then we'll get to the back end stuff tomorrow. Okay. So back at 7:15. I need to give you all an attendance word too. We'll do clerk. Attendance word clerk. Okay. Or yeah, okay, cool. Sweet. Well, see you all at 7:15.
Pause the recording.
Yes. Do that. Okay. So where we left off before we took our break is we talked a little bit about authentication and authorization, what those terms mean. And then we talked about how you might go about implementing your own custom login system. And I talked a little bit about the pros and cons of that, of doing that. And hopefully convinced you all that it's probably not a good idea in most cases to do it. And then we started talking about Clerk, which is a tool that allows you to, it's like a library you can bring in that implements all this login system stuff for you. And we implemented it in the blog project and added a Clerk-based sign-in workflow for a single protected page. And that's where we left things off. So we don't have that much left, but there's a couple other things I want to add to this application to sort of give an example of kind of what it would look like in actuality, like in more of a real application and less of a contrived example. So the first thing we're going to do, I talked about this before, but I'm going to break out some of this stuff into separate components. Instead of having that protected page being just like an inline div with stuff, I'm going to make some separate things here. So I'm going to take this code in green. I'm just going to stick this up here and paste this in. And then I'm going to replace this here with protected. Now, I do want to call out a few things. I'm using a few new, there's a few modifications I made to this code. In particular, there's this new user button and use user thing up here that I'm using. So I'm going to, oh, what the heck? I'm going to add those imports. So what is this being? What are these things used for? So just like before, we have this page is protected, but under it, I'm now rendering text that says welcome user.firstname. This user value is coming from this use user hook here. So this use user hook is something built into Clerk that you can use in any component. And what it will do is it will give you information about the currently logged in user. So if you want to get information like the user's name, their email address, if you want to implement your own like custom password changing workflows or things like that, Clerk has a bunch of hooks you can tie in to sort of get lower level control of how things work. This use user one is the only one we're going to talk about today. They have a bunch of others though that are, I will be very honest, some of them are a bit hard to wrap your head around. They're not documented all that well, but use user is one that's pretty well documented and pretty easy to understand. I believe if you're not signed in, user will be null. And there's also a value you can pull out of here called like signed in. That's a Boolean that's like, is the user signed in or not? So there's a bunch of things you can destructure out of here if you want. But I'll let that be an exercise on your own if you want to play around with that or look at Clerk's documentation. So that's what's going on here. We're going to print out the user's first name. Secondly, we're going to render this user button component. This is a pre-built Clerk component, just like the sign in and sign out components. And what this allows us to do is render a little avatar image that you can click that gives you the ability to have the user update their profile information and also to sign out. So this is something you typically put on like a navigation bar on a web application or something like that. You want to put it in like a global place where it's always shown. And by implementing this, you pretty much like with this, plus the sign in and sign up workflows, you pretty much get everything kind of for free. Like I guess I wouldn't say everything, but you have the majority of what you'd want in like user management, you kind of get for free from them. Joe, you said, are these supposed to be in app.js? Yes, so these changes are made in app.js. Sorry, I should have called that on the slide. So all I did was I added these imports to the end of the first line here, this import, and then I copied this in just kind of above or below the imports, and then I swapped out the protected route for this protected component. So really what I'm doing here is I'm refactoring what was under protected. Where is it? I'm refactoring like the div that was here before into a component just to make things a bit cleaner. This is probably what you'd actually do in a real application. You probably also put these in like separate files and stuff like that, but I'll leave that as an exercise to you all if you want to go that far. Okay. So now we've got these things here. If we go over to our application, you'll see we see a few new things. Welcome, Ryan. That's good. So it's pulling out the name from my logged in user metadata. And where's it getting that? Well, because I signed in with Google, it's able to pull that from my Google account information. There's a bunch of metadata that you can get sort of by default, like name, email, profile image. There's a bunch that Clerks just sort of supports. And what's cool is if let's say you signed in with like Apple or Facebook or GitHub. Clerk normalizes the data so you can access it the same way and get like all the users' profile information from any provider through the same interface. So if we enable like sign in with GitHub and you sign in with GitHub, this would still work perfectly the exact same way. So pretty cool. The other thing you'll see is we have this little button here. This is that user profile button. And you'll see that there's a couple interesting things here. I'm going to go to manage account first. So this gives us a lot of cool little account management stuff. So we can like add email addresses to our account. We can like update our profile information or profile photo. We can also do things like define a password. So right now, we can log in with Google and that's it, but we can't sign in with a password. So I could go here and actually set a password. And then now I could sign in either with Google or with my username and password or my email and password. I can also do things with Clerk where like it says, oh, I've got one device logged in here, but if I had another device logged in, I could like revoke access to that other computer, which is kind of cool. And I can also just sort of handle that GDPR case of like need to be able to delete your account. We've got delete account here. So you can actually like remove yourself from the system, which is cool. Cool. Any questions on any of that? Okay. Yep, so this is what you should all be seeing here. And yep, we kind of already went through that. That's what it used to look like before they redesigned their stuff. Okay, yeah, we're gonna get to that in a second. Before we do that, I just want to go through a couple more options here. Now that we can sign out, I want to show you kind of a few different ways you can approach signing in and sort of how Clerk handles all those different cases. So the first thing is, let's say I sign out. So remember in that Clerk dashboard, we set when you sign out and it redirects back to slash. So what we did here is it brought us back to the root. So that's why it redirected. Instead of going to slash protected, if I click login with Clerk, because that's a link to slash sign in, it'll bring me there. And now I can go through the same login workflow. Importantly, I signed out, so I got to log back in again. And because it wasn't at slash protected, it just brought me back to the page I was at. And now I could go to slash protected, and that works perfectly fine. Also, if I go to slash sign in, notice that because I'm already signed in, it just redirects me back to slash. Like it's smart enough to sort of handle a lot of these cases for you properly. This is the stuff that's really hard to get right when you build a system like this yourself. All these little edge cases around, is a user signed in here? Does the user have this metadata? Like they just have it all handled, and it just generally works pretty well. Lastly, I want to I'm going to delete my account. Actually, wait, before I delete my account, I do want to show you one more thing in Clerk. So in the Clerk dashboard, there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. And in particular, if you are like deploying a service that you're operating, what you're probably going to care the most about is this users tab. So what this will do is it'll actually show you all the users that have signed into your application and give you sort of like an administrative dashboard to work with them. So I could like reset their password. I could like ban them, keep them from logging into my service. I can like change their personal information. Clerk also allows you to set metadata on a user. So you can just sort of like store unstructured JSON in different ways on that user, which is kind of helpful sometimes. What I'm going to do is, oh, okay, it's not going to let me. I'll do it from here then. I'm going to go to manage account. And I'm going to go to security and then delete account. So delete account. And then once I do that, I go back to users. You'll see that that's empty. So deleted my account. And now if I come back over here and I go log in, and instead I go sign up, now you see it redirected me to sign up, that other endpoint we set up. So in here, I can go like set up the same thing here. I'll go like test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So see, they have all the security stuff. Whatever. I don't care what my password is. I'm not going to sign back in. Okay. Yes. And then they sent me an email. I gotta like get a verification code for my email. So let me quickly go grab that. Um, okay. So I got an email from them and it had this code in it. Oh, oh, it looked like there was some little case there that I might have not handled very well. Whatever. I'm gonna ignore that for now. Pretend you didn't see anything. Um, but now we're logged in. So if I go to protected, you'll see. Now, importantly, because I didn't sign in with Google, there's no account metadata associated with my account. So if I come back over here and I refresh, you'll see I'm logged in, like I'm there, but there's no sort of social account link. There's no profile information. I could go like test, make my first name test or something, and then come over here and refresh and you see test. So it's sort of, it handle like it'll, once you add the metadata in, it sort of handles it properly. But yeah. So anyway, I just want to sort of show like a good example here of like exercising some of the corner cases you may not normally do in typical user like using an application, just to kind of show you how Clerk tends to handle it. But I guess really the takeaway is like they figured a lot of this stuff out. It generally tends to work pretty well and it's pretty well executed. And it's like for development and small scale use in production, I think it's free. So it's like pretty good. And their pricing policy as you start to scale is also not that crazy. Cool. Any questions on any of that? Okay. So there's one last thing I want to do here, and that is we're going to add another protected route, just to sort of give you like a pattern you can follow. So I'm imagining that for many of you, in your capstone, you're going to need to include some sort of account system. And the way that we recommend you do that for this cohort is to use Clerk. So when you want to integrate this into your capstone, what I'd recommend is follow these slides kind of step by step, and just adapt each step to your capstone. And then this slide here, once you're sort of at the point where you're like, okay, I want to add a bunch of protected routes for all the different parts of my app that need to be protected, you can follow this pattern and just repeat this over and over for each route. Okay, so I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy this, and again, I'm just going to kind of like, put it below actually, I'm going to paste it in. And then protected. Okay. And then now, if I go to, what was it? Another protected route. And we now have that one. And same sort of way here, like if I sign out and then go another protected route, it's going to require me to sign in. Okay. So that is all I have for today. I said today was going to be a relatively light day. So I kind of want to leave it a bit open how you folks would like to use the rest of the time. I'll say one thing that I didn't talk about, but probably would be maybe worth quickly touching on is most likely you want to put that user button in like a navigation bar or some sort of like global place in your application. So we could stick it like up here in the corner. That wouldn't take very long. We could do that. If anyone has any questions about Clerk or Auth or anything like that, I'd be more than willing to talk about that. Or if you just have any just general questions about software, we can go through that too. Or if there's nothing, and that's fine too. So I guess let's stick the user button up in the top bar and just so that we have it there and it's kind of global and persistent. I think that'll be helpful. And then I'll kind of like open it up for if anybody has any questions. So let's see how Max structured this. So there is this the router provider and then home. And I'm guessing there's some sort of navigation bar thing being used everywhere. Max's blog. If anyone knows where this is, please call it out. I'm just going to kind of search around here until I can find it.
What are you looking for?
The wherever the top bar is in the app.
It is either in home or yeah, I think that's it right there.
Okay. Yeah, so Max didn't abstract it. Okay, I guess I figured he would have. Well, whatever. I'll still stick it up here. So I'm going to put a user button in there. And it auto imported it, but if it didn't do that, just make sure you import it from Clerk React. So gotta sign in first. It's also worth pointing out that Clerk's smart enough to realize if you sign in with Google or sign in with like a social provider, and then you click like sign in with a social provider, and it'll automatically link the accounts. So like if you sign in with Google the second time you log in, it will realize, oh, the first time you signed in with your regular email, the second time you sign in with Google, and it'll realize that that's like the same account behind the scenes. So it does some like kind of smart stuff like that, but typically it would be a little tricky to do well. So I'm going to do something like div class name. Let's go like top bar or something. What the heck? Okay. And then at CSS, let's go like top bar, display flex, line items, center, justify content, space between. Something kind of like that. Why isn't that H1 center? Oh, because we've got the heading, the spacing on their margin on that. Top bar. And then I'll go like margin top 16. Yeah, something kind of like that. Cool. That's all totally optional, but now we've got our little button up there. I thought Max had reused some sort of nav bar component everywhere, so this is, I guess, not as useful, but you can imagine if you had some sort of shared component for your top bar, you could stick it in there and that would be everywhere in your application. So that'd be kind of nice. Yeah, I guess one more thing I can maybe briefly touch on. So Joe had mentioned in chat some of the limitations around Clerk's free plan. So the way that Clerk works is every app you make has two environments. You have a development and a production environment. And what you can do is once you're ready to put your app into production, you actually create the separate production instance. And that will give you a separate publishable key, a bunch of other separate credentials. And what this means is in development, you have this instance you can use locally. And then in production, you have another instance you can use in production. So it sort of segments it nicely between the two environments, which is pretty good. Also keep in mind that in development, there's some rate limits and things like that, and pretty much everything's free. Like you can use whatever features you want, but then once you actually deploy it into production, there's certain features that make you pay extra for. In particular, I think you pay extra for like some of the like SMS related features, like if you want to get like 2-factor codes and stuff like that, they charge for that. They charge for all the fancy enterprise like SAML stuff, but all these vendors do that. Yeah. So anyway, I guess that's really all I wanted to say, where like if you want to deploy your capstone into production, like you probably don't want to use the development thing, you want to use the production thing. And that'll also do stuff like remove like development mode from the stuff in here. Also, if you pay Clerk enough money, they'll also remove their logo, so like doesn't have their branding all over it, but probably it's more than you all would want to pay to make that happen. I think you have to pay them like a couple $100 a month to get to that point. Yeah. I think that's really about all I have. Any other questions anyone has on this or anything else?
I got a question real quick.
Yeah.
How would so my capstone is a case management software, and I would the idea for account management and user authentication would be managed in-house instead of attaching being able to sign in with anything else. Like they have their organization username that is assigned to them. And a password that's managed by the admin team. How would I go about connecting a user database to Clerk?
Yeah, great question. I think the first thing though that I would ask is, where is the requirement around the users being managed in-house coming from? Is that something you're self-imposing on yourself, or something that like is being dictated to you by some external person?
For the sake of the project, I'm doing it for this. Usually when you have protected health information and stuff, attaching it using the staff username that's managed by IT and the admin team versus them using their work or personal email.
Yep. Okay, yeah. So it's kind of the rationale there is it's you want to have tight control over the data because it's PII and there's like HIPAA and stuff like that, and you don't know how like things like Clerk are going to handle that. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So something I've done with significant success in other applications is Clerk has this thing called a webhook. So I don't know if Max has talked about this all with you all, but the idea of a webhook is normally when you make an HTTP request, you have a client, like a web application, making a request to a server. And what that allows the web application to do is request data from the server. So like requests are going one way, like it's initiated from the client to the server. The server can initiate a request to the client. That's like not a thing you can do. So because of that, there is often a need to be able to send data kind of in that sort of direction. Or if you swap out the client for another server, to be able to send data from like one server to another server, sort of like machine-to-machine communication. And webhooks are a very common way of approaching that problem. So what a webhook is you give Clerk a URL for them to make a request to on your behalf whenever something changes about a user. So as an example, imagine you deploy your application on like test.com. Maybe you set up, I guess you should also be clear, your backend. So I guess like api.test.com or something. On your backend, you set up a route called like /clerk webhook or something. So api.test.com /clerk webhook. Then what you can do is you can go into Clerk and add a webhook, add an endpoint, and to something like, it's going to make me do HTTPS, I think. something kind of like this. And then you can say, I want to get events whenever any of these things happen. Let's just say like any user thing is changed. So what will happen is anytime anything changes about a user, so I'm just going to come over to here and I'm going to, for example, update first name to be like different. I don't even think I spelled that right, but whatever. And now I go over to webhooks. Logs. Yeah, there we go. Well, okay, it didn't work. Let me try this one more time. What I might actually do, I know this will work. If I delete the user and then I make a new user. Might also be that that's an invalid URL and that's causing problems. Yeah, there we go. Okay, yeah, it just took a second to, it was like a delayed reaction. So what this is doing is every time there's a user change, it will make a request to the backend and say, there has been a user change. And what you can do is you can listen to these events and use them to keep a database table on your system up to date with all the users in Clerk. And why this is really nice is you can let Clerk manage all the stuff it's good at. And then all your sort of protected information you don't want to give to Clerk, you can sort of hang off of that user table. So let's say you have like some sort of field on a user that's like protected health information. You store that on the users table in your database. In your own system, you can control all the security around how that's stored. The only thing you're doing is you're letting Clerk create users and update the rows or the columns in those users that it has access to, and delete users if they get deleted. So you're deferring the user management stuff to Clerk, but you're sort of still allowing yourself to keep non-Clerk metadata on that table and to do everything you want with it. I'm curious what you think of that solution and if you think that solves your problem.
You came at it from a different direction than I was thinking about it, but I think it still applies. What I was thinking was creating a database in Beekeeper or something for like user roles for, let's say, a case manager to be able to access their cases. And it still seems like I can defer the database management for the any kind of authentication. I can link, Beekeeper and Clerk together that way.
Yeah, and the way you do that, probably the easiest way is with webhooks like I'm describing here. Importantly, what Clerk is handling is all the authentication. What you would be handling is all the authorization. So we're going to talk about it tomorrow, but there's a pretty easy way when you make a request to get the user ID of the Clerk user associated with the user making that request. So once you have that user ID, you can link that to your database table and know which row corresponds. And then you've probably got things hanging off that are all your custom metadata. And you can have whatever custom application specific like rules you want to manage permissions.
Alrighty. Yeah. So yes, that does answer my question then.
Sweet. One thing I do want to quickly mention about webhooks, just because it's going to be a hang up if you want to use them. In order for Clerk to make a request to an application and send it a webhook, your application needs to be publicly accessible onto your internet. Now, obviously, if you run something on localhost in your system, you're behind a firewall. It's not something that Clerk can make a request to directly. So in order to allow Clerk to make a webhook to your application, there's a couple different ways you can do that. Probably the easiest is there's this tool called ngrok that you may or may not have heard of. There's a few others too. Another one called Local Tunnel that I've used with success in the past. But what this effectively lets you do, I'll do a little demo of it here. So if I make a new tab, I'm going to do ngrok HTTP 3000. What this will do is it'll run a little server locally. And what the server does is it communicates over a TCP socket with a server in their cloud. And their cloud server is hosted publicly on the global internet. So what happens is they give me this URL, and I can make a request to this URL, and I can access the blog running on my local system. So what's happening here is a request is hitting ngrok, going through their TCP tunnel to my local system, and then actually popping out of that local server I'm running, that little ngrok HTTP 3000 command. It's then making a request to my local server. The server is responding with the response, and it's tracing its way back. So sending it back over that TCP socket, and then there's a response back out to my client through ngrok's HTTP global thing. So why this is nice is you can start this locally, and then you can give Clerk an ngrok URL for your locally running application, and then it can make webhooks to your local application. So if you want to go down this path, I'd highly recommend you explore something like ngrok, or also other one that I've used is local tunnel. That's sort of the old-fashioned one. Same kind of idea. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, so to be clear, am I linking ngrok or local tunnel to the front end or the back end, or is it just accessing all local servers?
You want to link it to the back end. So I guess that,
Okay.
that wasn't a great example there because I linked it to the front end. But you want to effectively you want to use it so that you can make a request from Clerk to your local backend server and circumvent the firewall that's running in your networking environment. You're sort of you're punching a very carefully shaped hole to be that lets ngrok operate through your firewall. And the way that works is ngrok is making an outgoing TCP request to their server. So because it's outgoing, the firewall rules don't hit it. It makes it outgoing, and then because it's TCP, it's bidirectional. So like it can just send stuff back and forth. So that's how they're able to get around this. But it's just that, like, because HTTP is not bidirectional like that, you can initiate the webhook from your end to Clerk server. It's the other way around.
Gotcha.
Cool. If you end up going down this path of using webhooks, let me know. I've got some code I can send you that I've used for a webhook endpoint that sort of like does all the CRUD for users, and you can probably steal some of that if you want. Cool. Anybody else have any other questions? If not, it's totally fine, but want to give the space if there is some. Okay. Well, if we don't have any questions, then I think we're pretty much done for the day. I guess I'll quickly say that tomorrow, well, I guess I should say today, we talked about using Clerk in a front-end web context. So we mostly were focused on JavaScript, React, create React app, those kinds of things. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about Clerk in a backend context. So as a bit of a preview, think about you want to make a request to a server. You want to make sure that server, that request is only going to return a response if the user making the request is authenticated with Clerk. So we're going to talk about tomorrow how you would do that, how you would sort of like validate that the user making the request to the backend is properly set up with Clerk, and give you sort of the handles to, if you want to start to think about how you might do authorization, so permissions and things like that. I mentioned a little bit of that to Joe just now. We're going to cover it in more depth tomorrow. Cool. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, I think we're done for the day. So have a good evening and see you all tomorrow. Bye, folks.